Hello there, welcome to 5 and 5, the series where I go over 5 studies in 5 minutes or a lot more. That joke was never funny, it's never worked, I don't know why I keep it. Today we're talking about self-diagnosis, specifically in regards to mental health. If you're wondering if this is in response to any particular recent drama, the answer is always yes, but we're going to pretend like it isn't for the sake of everyone involved, including me. This is not meant to be the final say in the topic, I'm just offering up some information to maybe give those of you who do watch a slightly more informed perspective. Let's start with a study looking at the efficacy of self-diagnoses for a less murky condition, the flu. A 2011 study titled Self-Diagnosis of Influenza During a Pandemic, a Cross-Sectional Survey, set out to determine whether both laypeople's and healthcare workers' self-diagnoses of their own symptoms were accurate prior to laboratory testing during a winter flu pandemic in New Zealand. It turns out, no, not even a little bit. There was almost no difference between those who did and did not believe they had the flu in terms of who actually did. Self-diagnosis did not accurately predict the actual presence of the disease. Now, this actually isn't as big a deal as you might think. The symptoms matter more during a pandemic, so the fact that public health initiatives listing the symptoms of a disease doesn't do all that much good for helping someone diagnose themselves matters a lot less than getting people to either stay home and isolate if they have symptoms and or go get tested by an actual doctor. I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward. Symptoms matter regardless of a diagnosis, and getting a diagnosis is a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. But trying to diagnose yourself, even if you're a medical professional, doesn't seem to be a good way to reach that end. Before you get the idea that I'm taking the layperson is too much of an idiot to know anything about their body and must be at the behest of an ivory tower gatekeeper, I want to bring up this 2015 paper published in the British Journal of Guidance Counselling about their recommended approach to a client who has done the work of trying to diagnose themselves. The authors are mindful of power differentials in the counseling relationship and want clients to be the editors-in-chief of the meanings for their lives. For a self-diagnosed client, they don't want to demedicalize or depathologize a client's understanding of themselves. They just don't want to stop at their initial declaration of their own illness, and instead invite those clients to consider complementary ways in which their concerns might be more comprehensively understood. The authors understand that people often have good reasons for self-diagnosis, like validation or self-clarity. However, self-diagnosis is not a neutral activity. It often means living at least part of one's life on medical terms, and that carries as many risks as it does rewards. Of course, there's the accuracy concern, but perhaps even more important is the fact that in Western neoliberal societies, citizens accept and apply the dominant understandings of good or proper behavior to themselves in a way that is compatible with the marketplace. Yeah, self-diagnosis isn't done in a vacuum, and not all diagnoses, self or not, are created equal. For example, thousands of phone apps have been designed to help people diagnose their symptoms. And yet, a 2015 analysis of self-diagnosis smartphone apps published in Social Science and Medicine showed that the creators of these apps know they could be in a lot of trouble if they pretended that they could replace a diagnosis from a medical professional, and instead say their apps are designed for entertainment purposes only. That begs the question, so then what's the point? Self-diagnosis apps are overtly positioned as neutral, objective technologies for effecting a diagnosis that differs from the traditional hands-on approach from medical practitioners, which is completely undermined when they have to put "but not really" in the fine print. Well, technologies designed for self-diagnosis are part of a lucrative commercial market, promoted in the interests of the manufacturers who sell these technologies or pharmaceutical companies whose products are recommended by the devices. App-generated diagnoses don't offer access to prescriptions, laboratory tests, sick leave, or anything else, and so they do nothing to circumvent the gatekeeping doctor other than letting patients know about a medication that may or may not be owned by the same parent company as the app. Ask your doctor about fucolatol today. A lot of people are, sometimes rightfully, wary of personal biases when it comes to mental health professionals, but this wariness should also extend to resources that claim to help you diagnose yourself. A pharmaceutical company out to sell a drug is probably not more concerned about your well-being than the doctor able to prescribe it. No, medication isn't bad, I'm not saying that either. I've taken meds for my ADHD in the past and they've worked wonders. But medications are less cut and dry as solutions for mental illness. There's no virus or bacteria or objective measurement to point to as the underlying cause. Instead, they rely on a collection of symptoms that meet a certain criteria to form a diagnosis. It's not, the flu virus causes muscle aches and a runny nose. It's, you have a runny nose and muscle aches, and we call that the flu. That means the true cause of a mental illness requires some subjective interpretation, and that's not trivial. There are costs and benefits to attributing mental illness to either psychosocial or biomedical explanations, and they can affect both the treatment options considered and how an individual interprets their own state of being. A 2020 study in the Journal of Affective Disorders found that believing in the chemical imbalance hypothesis of depression predicted poorer treatment expectations and more long term depressive symptoms. Given that treatment expectancy plays an important role in treatment response, it's worth considering what causes we consider to be the most explanatory, because psychosocial and biomedical are pretty arbitrarily separated when you get right down to it. Thoughts and emotions are no less biological than genes, after all, and psychotherapies can be just as, if not more, effective in treating certain mental illnesses as medication. The real stigma we should fight here is the false notion that if non-biomedical solutions work, it means the mental illness wasn't real to begin with. This brings us to our last and most important study, the one at the heart of this video, and the one that guides my opinion on the topic the most. Biomedical Explanations of Psychopathology and Their Implications for Attitudes and Beliefs About Mental Disorders, published in the Annual Review of Clinical Psychology in 2019, discusses the history of attributions to mental illness and the social, clinical, and personal consequences for believing in causes from ancient evil spirits to modern biomedical explanations. The authors are very clear that stigma is a long-standing issue faced by people with mental illnesses, highlighting how characteristics of mental illness are used to designate outgroups with negative stereotypes and perpetuate discrimination and disadvantage. And it has been argued that disseminating information about the biomedical causes of mental disorders will reduce negative attitudes toward them, not unlike how a similar increase in medical understanding destigmatized cancer. However, because psychiatric symptoms affect a person's mental functioning, it may hold more sway over the perception of a person's identity. Yeah, it might reduce the blame ascribed to people with mental disorders, but it also might exacerbate negative attitudes in other ways. One of the studies referenced in this paper found that participants who watched a video of an individual describing his experience of psychosis and were given a biomedical explanation of his symptoms perceived him as significantly more dangerous and unpredictable compared to baseline measurements. He can't help it, might not have any malice behind it, but just because he can't help it doesn't mean he's not a threat. Speaking of identity, is a mental disorder an identity? I don't think there's a right answer there. An identity can be just about anything, and reducing stigma towards a group of people necessarily involves defining that group of people by an identity. However, groups of people, when defined by an identity, are essentialized to a certain degree, and the more that group is essentialized, the more the category they belong to will be seen as being natural and immutable, especially if that category is seen to be genetic. Thus, genetic explanations for mental disorders might contribute to essentializing them into a separate, naturally occurring category of human beings, which could imply that mental illness is untreatable. This doesn't just affect public perception. Studies consistently show that biomedical explanations evoke essentialist biases and lead to the assumption that mental disorders are relatively immutable and unlikely to remit. So, with all of that in mind, here's my take. If you have symptoms of a mental illness and you want to try strategies to change your behaviors and habits that are associated with that mental illness without seeing a professional, I think that's perfectly healthy. You don't need to be diagnosed with ADHD to try timers and planners. If you want a diagnosis because you think it will offer a blame-reducing explanation for hardships in your life, that's very understandable, but it's putting the cart before the horse. A diagnosis exists to serve the prognosis. And if you self-diagnose in order to adopt an essentialist identity, I think you're doing it for the wrong reasons. It may push you into believing that you'll always struggle because you're just like this, based on symptoms you Googled that have a lot of overlap between disorders. If you have symptoms that are interfering with your life and you don't know what to do, seek help from a professional. This isn't about taking your own health out of your hands. It's about getting a map of your mental health journey drawn by an actual map maker.